What's up, folks? So a lot of my content does take a bit of a swing where I'm going from one subject to another. That's what I get for having a lot of different interests at the same time and trying to get some projects done. But I do want to make sure to take a minute to revisit my near and dear, my dear friend, Warhammer combat cards, pardon. So I'm going to talk about laddering with Space Marines. And I know I touched a little bit on laddering with different factions, including Space Marines, but I wanted to go ahead and show off some decks. So I am laddering with Space Marines this season. Pay no attention to the Tyranids on the screen. I'm going to go ahead and go from most expensive to least expensive. I don't have Guilliman, so I'm not laddering with him. So we'll go ahead and start with Logan. And one thing that I like to make sure to keep in mind when I'm doing the ladder is you want to ladder efficiently, especially when it's still early in the season. So you want your Warlords that will win, your Warlords in your decks that will win games quickly. Chances are you'll get mostly favorable matches earlier on, which is good. You're more likely to win. But the downside is that, again, you will be favored, and so you're more likely to get less benefit from winning those games. So you want to play Warlords early on who will get fast kills so that you can get through to the points where you actually do face opponents who will give you trouble. Logan is particularly good because he's got that overflow damage you just saw. So anytime you do more damage to a card than it has hit points, the excess damage will be dealt as double damage to the adjacent card, the next closest adjacent card. Oof, ouch. And I'm also playing with some of the... Oh, and so here you want to hit the injured cards as hard as possible. And just to talk about some of the cards I've got in here, I've got my heaviest hitting melee card, hands down, in this thing. Just got rank 3 Berserk on this guy. Then I've got a Medicae in there just to help keep everything alive. Ooh, that's going to hurt. I also really like that because the Berserk also impacts its ranged attack. So its ranged attack is really scary. There we go. So why Logan is a really good momentum pick, and I talk about momentum decks being the decks that hit extremely hard, is because he does a lot of damage real quick, and that overflow damage helps you clear out kind of tar pit decks. Like this was a full Tau deck that could have taken a really long time to clear, except I was using the endless cards to jump off and take out tougher cards to the right? So that was a very quick match. I got 53 trophies, which is not bad, meaning that I was slightly favored to win that. I was at a slight deficit. I think that the Tau deck was favored to win. I think, maybe, but yeah. I'm not totally clear on how the math works out, but just to take a look at that deck again. Thinking. Yeah, just to take a look at that deck again. So I've got my single heaviest hitting melee card, got a Medicae to back him up, got an Inspiring Presence in there that also is high initiative to hopefully get kind of more first turns. Also has a lot of hit points, good melee, and has that Inspiring Presence. And then I've rounded out with a Big Game Hunter, just another piece that has very high melee relative to the cost. And then also rounded out with this guy. And I had a couple 12-point options. I included him because he recently got buffed in the latest balance patch. So I just wanted to kind of talk through the concept there, not necessarily the specific cards. The 60 range could be any of your heavy hitters. The Medicae could be any Medicae you want. The Inspiring Presence could be your highest level one, BGH, filler, etc. But this is kind of a rough blueprint for what I would do for a Logan deck, to have the very dedicated small deck of punchy heavy hitters and then a couple support pieces and have a nice thin deck. If you have a couple really powerful Space Marine cards you want to run, Logan is a great spot to run that. We'll get and jump to the next on the list. After Logan, our next most expensive Space Marines Warlord is Voldus. And I have given poor Voldus a hard time in the past, saying that he's just bad. And my biggest metric for that was just that he is very level dependent, because he's very level and cost dependent. So he benefits psychic attacks, and psychic cards are more expensive than others, and you want multiple psychic attack cards in a Voldus deck, which is already two things that make him very challenging to run. So you need those cards to be high leveled and durable to make them worth bringing. And then you do need... Okay, perfect. And then you need them to have the psychic attack to actually benefit from his trait. Now, once you get that, he becomes really terrifying, but you're relying entirely on out-leveling your opponent. If your opponent is higher level than you, you are almost certainly going to lose with Voldus. And that's the reason I call Voldus why I call Voldus outright bad. Ooh, Big Game Hunter. But target acquired. Thanks, buddy. Yeah, which is probably a little harsh, but still. And this is a weird deck. No, this is a Snickerout deck. Okay, yeah, so that is scary. But But I will say with this, I've got some very highly leveled cards to make my Voldus deck a bit of a bully, as you can see here. So this guy is now hitting for 100 psychic damage, 137 psychic damage, and they both have Psionic Blast, so they're hitting the entire board at the start of every turn. So by the end of a game with my Voldus deck, you can see it getting a little bit stupid. So there are power plays with Voldus, but when I get to the higher ladder bits where I'm going kind of at my competitive peak, my Voldus deck will fall apart completely. Just because if I'm out leveled, if there's a bunch of target acquired and better big game hunter stuff on the board, if I lose either of these, I'm at a huge, huge deficit. So he's only one I really risk early in the season. But if you're going to run Voldus, that's my personal vote, is that you maximize your Psionic Blast, maximize your Medicae, and run a thin deck that doesn't totally benefit from Voldus' ability, but does really support those key pieces. So this guy and this guy being the ones you play first, build them up as you drop other cards to make them more powerful, and then they will clear the board fairly effectively. So that is my Voldus deck. Who's next? Next up on the Space Marine list, I believe, is Helbrecht himself. We'll check. Oh no, Azrael. So we did Logan, now we're looking at Voldus, then we go to Azrael. And now my Azrael joke is a little bit of a deck, or my Azrael deck is a little bit of a joke because he's level 2. But then I took a couple cards that have been buffed this season and tried to be as green as possible. So heavy on the Medicae because his ability relies on cards being on the board a long time. Azrael really wants to use your most durable cards, but you also want to make sure they're cards that do have some hitting power as well, otherwise they don't benefit from his ability. Oh man, going up against this Dark Angels livery with an Orc deck. Seeing a lot of orcs. So you want to play these cards early. One challenge I have with Azrael is that I end up playing decks that are somewhat thin and slow. So with Azrael, you really want first turn so you can go ahead and prime your ability, because any card has to be on the board for one full turn, or you have to have one full turn where nothing gets a benefit from his ability at all. Because I didn't do something last turn, so I can't get the bonus for doing something different this turn. And I recently got several of my Dreadnoughts to be in a level where I consider them effective here. So it's been really cool to see this one. Both of my Dreadnoughts. Ooh, and that's bad. But then you're going to see them really quickly kind of ramp up. So that buff is very powerful against cards that have really good base stats already. These two have a bunch of hit points already, so they're very durable. And they're green, so they work with Azrael. Yay! So this is my current Azrael deck, one I've been really enjoying, but it does struggle a little bit because, man, that stat boost is going to be huge. It does struggle a little bit because it is low level. And once you start getting into competitive games, you're going to have to play your Warlord. And if your Warlord is level 2, especially a very expensive legendary Warlord, it's just not going to be very effective. That was the best thing that could possibly have happened because that gives me a chance to play my Medicae, which should keep me alive from this guy. Boom. And then we can switch it. Rawr. Now, I did make a mistake there, but yeah, it still should comfortably survive that. And then target acquired will go away, regen triggers, yeah. So getting level 3 regen on this was kind of the big clincher. Several of these decks that I'm playing right now, I've really only just gotten the cards to the level where I want to run them. And it's those rank 3 traits. And I mentioned that in a couple other videos before, where rank 3 is the trait point where you start being truly competitive. But yeah, all wins so far, excellent. And I'm not all that high on the ladder. Haven't even hit 6K yet. Space Marines are my highest laddered faction right now, but give it a minute. Pros up, pros up. Thinking, we're thinking. I did not click on that. That's what I get for clicking around trying to get stuff to load. Okay, next. And I'm rocketing through these, but hopefully this is helpful. Just to recap that again, it's similar to the other decks where you're relying on buffs. So similar to the Voldus deck, I've got 2 really heavy hitters, Medicae and Taunt, and then a couple fillers that'll fit in here. This can be whichever ones you want in kind of that 50, 49 point range, but you want to emphasize hit points and also decent range, decent length stats, and then also high attack stats. So it's really kind of a tricky balance to strike, and there's a chance that Azrael decks may be some of the most varied decks in the entire Space Marine lineup, which is kind of cool, because his trait is attack type agnostic, right? So you can put anything in there and it'll benefit from that trait. So I really like Azrael. I think his ability is really cool, because it's attack type agnostic, because it doesn't really care which way you go or what kind of attack type you use, as long as you use different ones. And you can alternate with just 2, right? So it's tempting to run all 3 attack types in an Azrael deck where you have Psychic, Ranged, and Melee, but as long as you're not using the same one every single turn, it doesn't matter. So having just 2 attack types balanced is really the better way to go, where it's Ranged and Melee is my personal favorite because you get the best, most efficient kind of points for punching power, but you could go Psychic and Ranged or Psychic and Melee and kind of the same impact. But if you go all 3 traits, you're probably going to struggle because cards that have all 3 attack types either have really bad attack types in several of those, or are extremely expensive, or both. So we're going to go ahead and jump to Helbrecht. And so Azrael is one that I'm really excited to ladder with more aggressively once I level up Azrael himself, because his stats at level 2 are really bad for a 40-point card. 125 hit points within big game hunter territory. No thank you. So we'll go up to Helbrecht, who I'm pleased to have at level 6. And here you're going to see something very similar to my Logan deck, although I've gone a little bit harder on melee punching power, and interestingly, have the Space Wolf in this one where I didn't in the other one. This is another deck I run as Momentum. I do really, really like Helbrecht because he's actually one of the most flexible of the Space Marine Warlords. Not because his ability works with multiple attack types. It does. So you only get the attack buffs for melee kills. However, once you get the attack buffs, it applies to every attack type. So it doesn't matter whether you get the... yuck. And he's going first too, gross. It doesn't matter whether you get the... What am I saying? Anyway, thing being that even if you're only getting the buff for melee kills, you do still benefit your ranged attacks. So Helbrecht deck's actually very scary shooting later on because Space Marines have very good shooting even on their melee cards. But one thing I really like about Helbrecht is you can play with anything, right? So he's got probably the widest range of card types you could put in there because all you care about is a good range or a good melee stat. And of course you can have other stats all you want, but you don't need them. Which makes him a very satisfying kind of turn your brain off Warlord to play. Can be a little challenging because you do run thin decks and you can get snowballed against, but chances are you'll be fairly effective. You just sort of stack the deck with your few most burly, rough and tumble melee cards. Now in some of these games we've seen a lot of the cards actually shift lanes, which is always scary, but it does seem to be a little bit random, right? Where the anti-infantry moved away from my infantry over here. He's infantry, right? Yeah. Moved away from my infantry and over to this guy, which nerfed its offense. This is ranged. 163 range. See, that's what I'm talking about. Now, I'm just focusing on melee, but anytime I do want to do a ranged attack, it'll hit real hard. And I think I just got this guy all right. Yeah, no problem. 400 damage. Peace. So Helbrecht is one that is a really good momentum deck, but also does actually get quite powerful late game. So it's still a competitive piece to use at the top, but is very, very level dependent. Most of the best cards in a Helbrecht deck are going to be legendary or rare, or legendary epic. But he's going to struggle with kind of your common and your rare cards. He still can do fairly well, but it is something where you do want to watch that. Come on. Good times. He's still one where you can struggle a bit, unless your cards are very high level. So, and especially him himself. Helbrecht himself is another case where he's pretty bad if he himself is not leveled highly. Nowhere near as bad as Azrael, but still. All right, next up we have Akran himself. And this is one where going into this, I wasn't sure what I was running. It's all Ultramarines. I generally avoid laddering with Akran. He's a really good, safe pick because you can play anything with Akran. It can be anything at all. All he does is give a defensive buff to everything. Because it's a defensive buff, I believe he's the only Space Marines Warlord who does a defensive buff. By definition, he's slower than the others because all of the others do offensive buffs that make them hit harder. So that makes him slower, but then the biggest thing that bothers me about laddering with Akran decks is that it is so very slow. So very slow. But the worst part about that is that you are laddering. If you hit a mirror match against another Akran deck, then my god, is it a slog. So your best bet for laddering effectively and especially quickly is to run a deck that at least on some level counters Akaran, so the Akaran games don't slow you down too much, but then also so that you're still playing faster games, because usually more aggressive, faster decks are better Akaran counters. And yeah, and you want to ladder efficiently. You don't want to play something that's a very slow plotting anti-Akaran deck if you have any kind of time crunch at all. So you can see the durability is really important here. I'm kind of chainsawing through this, but also it's pretty clear that it is taking a very long time. And again, not having any kind of offensive boost, I do really recommend including some Inspiring Presence in here so that you do get at least some offensive bonus, just in general. Because you're not getting one for taking the defensive Space Marine Warlord. But yeah, biggest thing about Akaran, games take for frickin' ever. And mirror matches take like an entire day by themselves. So I try to avoid that. And so again, yes, it's key that you run some level anti-Akaran tech in your deck because there's a very good chance you run up against very slow ones that take a long time to bring down, but also ones that will be lower ranked than yours that are hard to beat. So just to throw the note in there, and I think I've said it in other places as well, one of the biggest things you want to watch out for when laddering effectively is you want to look for the decks that will tend to be really hard to beat, but also be low trophy rating, so that if you lose to them, you'll take a giant penalty. And those ones are still the kind of boogeyman. You've got Akaran and you've got Badruck. So you need to make sure you're playing against Akaran and Badruck whenever you can, and that the tech you have in your decks is able to take them both down. That's much less of an issue since the somewhat recent changes that Warhammer Combat Cards made, where you play a much more varied level of... where you will not see another Warlord twice in a row, or even twice within a span. It'll rotate through and you'll see a bunch of other Warlords in between, which has been good and bad. It's been great for the variety of the game, great for the actual play of the game, but it can actually hurt your trophy counts. So instead of matching against decks that are closely ranked with yours, could be anywhere from very much ranked below or very much ranked ahead. And that can help you progress, but it can also kind of hold you back because you may lose to lower trophy count decks that will then give you a big penalty to your victory points. And the penalty for losing to an underrated deck is higher than the penalty, or than the benefit for beating an underranked deck. So if you're going against decks that are underranked to you, that can slow you down real fast. Okay, so we did Akaran. Again, Akaran you can build however you want. I get a personal pleasure out of running entirely Ultramarines Akaran decks, which you can do because there are plenty of Ultramarines. Doesn't matter if it's melee, ranged, or psychic, but very effective no matter the attack type. Next up, getting close here, I believe we are on our very last Space Marines Warlord. The cheapest by a month. Nope, we've got two more. Artemis himself, who I personally think is the strongest of the Space Marine Warlords, and that has been held up in PvP, but I haven't seen the full data for the synced PvP events, but I haven't seen the data for ladder play. So this is a really good matchup, and one of the reasons that Artemis is really good is if I can manage to get kills against the Glogothrox player from my drops. So if I can get that guy to take lethal damage just from deploying cards, that will not count for the damage buff, or the damage debuff, because my card didn't actually do the damage. Same with Skull Taker's auto kill, same with Illic Night Spear, same with the Parasite. If the source of the lethal damage was not the actual card itself, then that card will not actually suffer the penalty to attack stats. I'm going to take a bunch of that here, though. And Artemis is one of the funny ones. So he doesn't have a stat buff. Oh, this is going to be great. He does not run a stat buff. So his cards don't get more powerful as you play, but every time you drop a card, it's more effective because you get the free damage. So right there, I did 47 damage to that thing just for playing a card, which is awesome. I'll take the 18. Bring it on. And so you can play a little bit cagey and then rely on your drops to actually do a bunch of extra damage. Now, you can't rely completely on your drops because then you're just losing all of your cards. So you still want to pack good cards in here, but, you know, look at that. We've hit that thing really hard and we haven't even actually hit it. We're going to Psychic. You do have to play a little cagey, but that's one of the better things about Artemis is you can be very strategic. You usually play a balanced deck that has a bunch of different attack types, can kind of fall back or lean on any of them. Ooh, that was maybe a mistake. I didn't kill either one of them. can fall back on any one of them and doesn't have to rely on a single attack type, but then is getting free damage. So it's an offensive deck, even if your cards aren't on any particular offensive theme. And dead. It's good. Had those been switched, had the Bloodthirster been to the left, I think the Hellbrute would have survived because the middle would have been helped. Oh boy, we got all the scrubs at the end here to just kill my attack stats. Glogothox is very, very scary. Another slow one because it relies on slowing down your opponent. If you run into an endless and fear-heavy Glogothox deck, it can slow down to an absolute crawl. Glogothox, very, very deep Glogothox deck versus a very thin Acheran deck is like the saddest game of all time. The one can't hurt the other, and the one is doing no damage. So one's doing no damage, and the other one is just not killing anything. So it's ridiculous. Yeah, so that was a bit intimidating because it was a very thick Glogothox deck. I got lucky that it was points heavy in the middle, so I got some very effective drops against those two big guys. Because that's if it had been all like 20 cost cards, it would have gotten minimal benefit out of it because it just would have been the damage would have been spread out so much throughout that. But I got lucky there. Okay, last one. It really is the last one this time, and then I will stop because the video is getting a little bit lengthy. But I'm not looking at specific cards. I've just been looking at deck archetypes. To talk about this real quick, this was kind of fun. I just threw sort of my favorite cards in here that all have a variety of attack types, leaned on several that have been buffed this season. I believe all 3 of these were buffed, and he was too. And then one that I just got trait rank 3 for, being Tyberos. So I've got a big melee spoof in there just for fun, but I could spread the points on these last cards out much more evenly, and that's kind of a better Artemis deck, because with Artemis you just spread everything evenly across the board. You don't really want to run any big cards, because if you start doing that, you end up running a thinner deck and then get less benefit out of his ability. What this could use is some target acquired, it could use some barrage, it could be a little bit more range focused, and then I think it probably would be a little bit more effective, but I really like it as is, because it can tangle in melee, or can hang in melee, still does some damage ranged, and just is an all-around fun deck. We'll kind of see what this turns into when I get to the upper ladder with Space Marines this season. But yeah, until then, this is what I'm running. And then Tol'Maron. Tol'Maron is one of the best Space Marine Warlords, but he's very one-dimensional and easily countered. One of the big reasons being that there are a lot of ranged decks out there that are just better. Like Tau can cut Tol'Maron to ribbons. And then some of the things like Acheran is pretty good against him. Glogothox is very good against him. Artemis is good against him. So some of the top performing, most powerful decks are really good counters to Tol'Maron, but the majority of decks are pretty vulnerable to him. So he's another good momentum pick. He is the cheapest, and again, you can do a really good job just putting in your most powerful shooting cards in there and just calling it a day. But most Tol'Maron decks that you will see build themselves around a couple really big punchers. Usually this guy and the other one. Very descriptive. This guy and the other one. The big game hunter and then this thing. This thing's stats are just bananas. Like that base attack of 122. That is Skull Taker? That is Skull Taker. Alright, that's going to be a bummer for him. Skull Taker can be a really good matchup against Tol'Maron, but he's got to have the attack to follow through. And here I don't think he's going to do enough damage to clear that. And I'm going to punish him back. Doesn't have any ranged. It is always a decent idea to include some ranged in your Skull Taker decks, because you can lean really hard on melee, of course, but there's some of the most powerful melee cards also have a meaningful ranged attack, so you don't have to completely give up on the one to get the other. And that would have made a difference here. He would have been blinking some more damage, and this guy would be a lot closer to dead. Yeah, and this is a fairly low-level Skull Taker, just because it looks like it doesn't have full deck points if he's running these guys in there. So you'll get to see a Tol'Maron deck in all its glory. Excuse me. Tol'Maron is one of the decks you can also run 3 cards. You run these 2 and then the third flyer, and then that's it. And then it's a very tough nut to crack. Oh, we actually killed one. Killed 2. Look at that. This guy is just crazy. 71 base damage for 16 points, and then also has poison. But we're not going to get to that, because this thing has 200 damage. And there you see Tol'Maron. Poof. Hyper aggressive. Tol'Maron takes a little bit of time to ramp. He's still a really good momentum deck, just because he does clear games fairly quickly. But because you have to build up that attack stat, he's not as good of a momentum attacker as Logan. Logan is a lot better because you can do Furious Charge with a really heavy hitter, little target acquired, and you can just wipe boards very quickly without having to have that ramp that Tolmaron needs. So that was it. That was all of the decks I'm running in Space Marines. That was just some of the cards I'm using. I tried to talk about the archetypes in each deck and not necessarily the specific cards because everyone's collection and levels are going to vary a bit. So hopefully that was helpful. Cheers. Till next time.